Hello. I know that I have been rather tardy in posting my videos. My last video was in June. But the thing is that before posting a video, I always ask myself, what is it that I have to say that would not be said by anybody else? So, because I'm looking always for some unique content, I don't very often find much to say. And I have found such a content today. This is basically going to be about three poems. I don't think that I'm going to talk about all the three poems in this one video. There'll be two very short poems that I'll talk about in one video, and a slightly longish one, which I'm going to talk about in the next one. Now, let us go back 25 years. Let us go back to a horrendous Sunday, 31st of August 1997, when many of us all across the world woke up to the news of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. And I'm not going to talk very much about the death because that has now been substantially chronicled by tons and tons of people. There is hardly any country which did not in some way mourn the princess. Tony Blair famously described her as the people's princess. But what I'm actually going to do today is look at three poems that were published in the British press at that time. One, I think, was published in The Independent, and there were two that were published in The Guardian. So the first two poems that I shall be talking about, one is by Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes was, many of you will know, at that time Ted Hughes was the poet laureate. And so this was a part of his job description that he had to write to commemorate royal events. So before Ted Hughes, of course, the poet laureate was John Benjamin, who had written a poem for the wedding of Charles and Diana in 1981. And soon after that, after a few years, John Benjamin died, and the poet laureateship went to Ted Hughes. And one of the first poems that Ted Hughes produced was a poem called Rain Charm for the Duchy, which was written to mark the christening of Prince Harry. But enough about that. This is a poem that Ted Hughes wrote for the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales. It's a very short poem, but he has managed to pack a lot into it, which is what a short poem usually does. So without further ado, let us go on with the poem. It's called Poem for a Lost Princess. Mankind is many rivers that only want to run. Holy tragedy and loss make the many one. Mankind is a holy crowned mother and her son. For worship, for mourning, God is here, is gone. Love is broken on the cross, the flower on the gun. Short poem, but there is so much to unpack in the poem that I think that we probably would be better advised to look at it a little bit more carefully. So what is going on? Mankind is many rivers that only want to run. I think, opinions may differ, but I think that what Ted Hughes is trying to do here is to say that mankind is never constant. Obviously, I would now I would quibble with Ted Hughes over the use of the word mankind. I would probably prefer humankind, but then again, that may not rhyme very well. So therefore, mankind it is. Anyway, humanity. So therefore, humanity is never constant. So mankind is many rivers that only want to run. Holy tragedy and loss make the many one. And I think, it's very curious the way in which he is using that particular phrase, holy tragedy and loss make the many one. Is he turning Diana into a Christ-like figure? Is that what is happening? Because just as the death of Christ brings people together, The death of Diana brought people together. So are we witnessing something like the apotheosis of Diana? Is that what's going on? That I think is something that we would probably want to think about. Holy tragedy and loss make the many one. The other thing that perhaps should be kept in mind is that the death of Diana was very much marked as a national tragedy, if not an international one. So therefore, it was marked as a national tragedy, essentially. And so therefore, is this also a way in which Ted Hughes is signaling the fact that the church and the state are one? Because many of you will know that initially the plan was that she would be given a private burial by the Spencer family. And I think it was Prince Charles who insisted that as the mother of the future king, she actually deserves a state funeral. So a state funeral was very hasty. I mean, it wasn't quite a state funeral because the heads of state didn't fly down, but it looked like a quasi-state funeral. And that is something which Prince Charles apparently was very, very insistent upon, is that, this is the mother of a future king, and, her death should be commemorated in a befitting manner. And so that's what basically happened. So therefore, her funeral is almost like a national occasion, and so therefore, her funeral is a national occasion, but it is also a religious occasion. So, the fusing of church and state. For worship, for mourning, God is here, is gone. I love that line, God is here, is gone, because, when you are mourning, very often one of the things that we say, almost accusatorily towards God is, in a very accusatory tone, we say, where are you? Right? When we say, where are you? The assumption seems to be that we don't know where we are, and so therefore we are thinking that God is gone, because if you were here, how could you allow such a tragedy to happen? So where are you? So God is here because we are still talking to God, but we are telling God, where are you? How could you allow this to happen? Where are you now when we need you? So therefore, God is here, is gone. You're here, but I don't know where you are. Love is broken on the cross. Very clear allusion to Christ. The flower on the gun. The flower on the gun, of course, is an allusion to the gun carriage. It is the gun carriage on which Diana was carried for her funeral at Westminster Abbey. After which, of course, her body was shifted to a hearse, and it was taken to Altrop, which is where she lies buried now. So, that's the Ted Hughes poem. Mankind is many rivers that only want to run. Holy tragedy and loss make the many one. Mankind is a holy, crowned mother and her son. And I think there's this one line that I forgot to sort of, discuss with you, which is mother and son. So when the mother and son is being referred to, well, clearly Diana is being turned into a Madonna-like figure, right? There is a book that is out called Saint Diana. So much like Saint Mary. So that I think is something which we really have to keep in mind. Mankind is a holy, crowned mother and her son for worship, for mourning. God is here, is gone. Love is broken on the cross. The flower on the gun. The next poem which I'm going to look at, this is a poem by Carol Ann Duffy. Carol Ann Duffy, of course, many of you will know, subsequently became the Poet Laureate. So in this particular video, I'm going to basically present to you the poems of two Poet Laureates, Ted Hughes, who was then the present Poet Laureate, and Carol Ann Duffy, who was then the future Poet Laureate. Of course, people didn't know then that Carol Ann Duffy would become the Poet Laureate. This poem by Carol Ann Duffy is called September 1997. So here we have it, September 1997. And I think the title is also a little reminiscent of Auden, right? So, September 1997. Whatever in love means, True love is talented. Someone vividly gifted in love has gone. You went down to St. James's Palace as night fell, candles shone. You saw a vast and passionate queue silently form, as though history was a giant shaken from sleep by love. Then you looked at your hands. Newsprint covered them like gloves. England's crown is rusting. The century bleeds to its end. You stand in a queue in darkness, mourning an unmet friend. The stranger beside you, the same. A million dying flowers smell like fame. Ted Hughes was doing his job. It was his duty as a poet laureate. Remember that this whole custom of poet laureateship was created with the restoration of the monarchy in England in 1660, with King Charles II coming to the throne. John Dryden, many of you will know, was the first poet laureate, and there have been many, many subsequent ones, most famously William Wordsworth, Lord Tennyson. And so therefore, Ted Hughes was just doing his job. But I don't think Carol Ann Duffy, she in this poem is not doing her job, because nobody asked her to write a poem. She wrote a poem because she absolutely felt that she had to. Okay, whatever in love means. This, of course, is a reference to the cringe-worthy interview that was given by Charles and Diana soon after their engagement was announced, when the interviewer famously asked him, are you happy? And they said yes. And then the interviewer said, and obviously in love. And Diana said, of course. But Charles said, whatever in love means. And if you look at the footage of that interview, and you find Diana giggling and saying yes in agreement, but there is a look of worry and fear that comes on her face almost immediately. What does he mean? What do you mean he says whatever in love means? So a lot of people look at that interview now, and they now see there very clear proof that Charles was probably never in love with Diana at all. He was just doing his duty. Because, once he had finished proposing to her, the first thing that he did, there was no kisses, there was no nothing. He just immediately ran to telephone the Queen, and then he said, I've done it now. Not the most romantic thing to do immediately after, being accepted when you're proposing marriage. Anyway, so whatever in love means, true love is talented. Someone vividly gifted in love has gone. You went down to St. James's Palace as night fell. This is a description of very, very long queues that formed outside St. James's Palace. St. James's Palace was where they had opened several condolence books, and people were queuing there through the night to be able to write something in that condolence book. Yes, I remember that Kolkata at British Council, they had opened a condolence book as well. I remember going there and writing something. Yes. So right here in Kolkata, and I think in embassies and high commissions all across India, there were condolence books that had been opened for this very purpose. You went down to St. James's Palace as night fell. Candles shone. You saw a vast and passionate queue silently form, as though history, capital H, as though history was a giant shaken from sleep by love, capital L. So therefore, it is almost as though history had been shaken out of its normal quotidian lethargy by the sheer power of love. So history is being personified as a figure that is asleep. Love is personified as a figure that actually shakes it awake. Then you looked at your hands. Newsprint covered them like gloves. And that image I find really poignant because, Diana, for the vast public, really, the relationship that the vast public had with Diana was really through newsprint. Remember that she was dead when internet was just coming into its own, right? 1997. So therefore, Diana never actually transitioned to the digital age at that point, because digital age hadn't technically started then. So it was basically television news. It was basically documentaries, and it was mostly newspapers and magazines. And it is interesting that she says that you look down at your hands, newsprint covered them like gloves. England's crown is rusting. And that I think she clearly means as criticism, because if you remember, there was a lot of criticism of the Queen because she wasn't in London, she was in Scotland at Balmoral, where she was taking care of William and Harry. And a lot of people said, why isn't she here in London? Why is not there a flag that is flying at half mast at Buckingham Palace? Why is the flag staff at Buckingham Palace bare? There should be no flag on top of Buckingham Palace when the Queen isn't there. So there is no rule for that. But the public demanded a flag on, at half mast, and that is what the royal family eventually, bowed to public pressure and conceded and obliged. England's crown is rusting. The century bleeds to its end. You stand in a queue in darkness, mourning an unmet friend. And I think every time I read that line, mourning an unmet friend, I still choke up because in a very strange way, a lot of people actually regarded Diana as a friend. I mean, I can't imagine too many celebrities having that effect of somebody that you've never met in your life, somebody you've never even seen in your life. I of course had seen her, when she was in Calcutta on February 15th, 1992. But there are people who had never even seen her. So their relationship with Diana was entirely conducted over newspapers and magazines and then pictures of her and the odd television news footage of her. And yet, how did she manage to create this sense of loss, this sense of mourning? Grown people were weeping and howling on the streets. Surely she couldn't have met all of them. So what had she done to people? So you're mourning an unmet friend, the stranger beside you, the same. A million dying flowers smell like fame. And so what is Diana therefore? Is she just a famous person? Is she a friend? So there are all these questions that Carol Ann Duffy puts together in this poem. And that is what comes out, this extraordinary poem. So I'm going to read the whole poem all over again. And this is where my first video is going to end. And after which we shall tackle a longer poem by Carol Rumens, which is perhaps my favorite. But we'll come to that later. So anyway, before this video is over, I'd just like to read this poem again. September 1997. Whatever in love means, true love is talented. Someone vividly gifted in love has gone. You went down to St. James's Palace as night fell. Candles shone. You saw a vast and passionate queue silently form, as though history was a giant shaken from sleep by love. Then you looked at your hands. Newsprint covered them like gloves. England's crown is rusting. The century bleeds to its end. You stand in a queue in darkness, mourning an unmet friend. The stranger beside you the same. A million dying flowers smell like fame.